Onto your headphones and pour your favorite beverage. It's time for the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Now, fresh off the sidelines, your host, Matt McPeak.
Fantasy freaks and geeks, what is up? Welcome to the NFC North offseason recap 2020 season preview. This is the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. I am Matt McPeak. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. We're going to be checking out the four teams in the NFC North, starting with the Green Bay Packers. 13-3 last year. They were 6-0 in the division. The Packers made the playoffs last year for the 9th time in the 12 seasons with Rodgers at quarterback. It was head coach Matt LaFleur's first year in Green Bay. He led them all the way to the conference championship game against the 49ers. They got smoked up in that game. They lost 37-20. They gave up 284 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns. The rushing defense was the biggest issue for the Packers all year long. Really, they allowed 7th most rushing yards per game and the 9th most fantasy points per game to running backs. But it wasn't all just the defense's fault for that conference championship loss. The Packers didn't score until middle of the third quarter. There was a lot of chatter going into the 2019 season about whether or not Aaron Rodgers and Matt LaFleur could work together, whether they would coexist, if Rodgers would really adjust to a new offense. And I'm not sure we really got the answer to that question. They finished 14th in scoring last year, which was only the third time in the 12 seasons with Aaron Rodgers that the team did not finish in the top 10 in scoring. Obviously, that's not counting the 2017 season when Rodgers got hurt. I think last year was a pretty good sign as to what Matt LaFleur wants the offense to look like. They ran the ball 411 times, about 5 more rushing attempts per game than in 2018. They were right in the middle of the league at 16th as far as rushing attempts per game. So I think 2020 will be some more of that. I think the moves that they made this offseason point to them moving towards more of a run-centric offense. And free agency was pretty typical of Green Bay. They didn't do much at all. They signed 4 players while losing 6 starters from last year. 3 linebackers all walked out. Blake Martinez, Kyle Fackrell both going to the Giants, and B.J. Goodson going to the Browns. They bring in linebacker Christian Kirksey to fill one of those holes at linebacker, and they signed a tackle, Rick Wagner. Wide receiver Devin Funchess was re-signed. They signed him to a 1-year deal, and then they re-signed tight end Mercedes Lewis. So they lost Bulaga, but they got Wagner. They lost Jimmy Graham, but they re-signed Mercedes Lewis. They also lost Geronimo Allison, who was he was a thing for them earlier in the season, and then he just kind of fell off. I really thought we'd see the Packers be a little more aggressive this year with Rodgers another year older, with a new coaching staff in place. But they do the Green Bay thing. They just sit back and look to build through the draft, which has to be frustrating if you're Aaron Rodgers. With deep threat guys like Rashad Perriman, Robbie Anderson, Demarcus Robinson were all available, and they would all be great fits in Green Bay with veterans like Emmanuel Sanders, and even A.J. Green was available. The only wide receiver the Packers added was Devin Funchess. He is a former second-round pick by the Panthers in 2015, but he only played there for 4 years. Then he signed with the Colts after the Panthers decided to decline his 5th-year option. Funchess only played 1 game for the Colts before getting hurt. But he led the Panthers in air yards and ADOT in his last 2 years in Carolina, sorry. So I think Funchess can, if he can stay healthy, he should get plenty of opportunities to hit on one or two deep balls every game. Rodgers has always been one of the best deep ball passers in the league. Look back at all those Hail Marys he's completed over the years. Plus, he's got Devontae Adams soaking up a lot of attention. So Funchess is definitely in a good spot. We'll see if he can flourish in Green Bay. Jimmy Graham saw 60 of the 94 tight end targets last year, and him leaving opens up a lot of targets for either Mercedes Lewis, who had 19 last year, Robert Tonyan, he had 15, and then Jay Sternberger, who had only one target in the regular season, then only had 3 in the postseason, but he caught a touchdown in that conference championship game. I drafted him in my startup dynasty league with one of my last picks, so I'm excited to see what he can do with Rodgers over the course of a full year. He'll be going into his second year now, so maybe we can get something out of him. As far as the draft goes, they made 9 picks overall, 3 in the 6th and 2 in the 7th. So they made 5 picks in the last 2 rounds. Over the past 2 years, the Packers have made a bunch of moves to acquire all those late-round picks. So with the biggest surprise pick of the entire draft, in my opinion, Green Bay they traded up 4 spots to take Jordan Love, quarterback from Utah State. This was one of the deepest wide receiver classes ever. One of the biggest holes for the Packers was wide receiver. It still is. And they decided not to take a single wide receiver in this draft. And if the quarterback in the first round wasn't head-scratching enough, they then took a running back in the second round, despite having one of the better running back tandems in the league with Aaron Jones, who tied Christian McCaffrey for most touchdowns last year, and Jamal Williams. So two pretty puzzling picks. Pretty puzzling picks by the Green Bay Packers there in the first 2 rounds of this past draft. Despite having that horrible run defense, they only used 3 of their 9 picks on defenders, and 2 of them were 7th-round picks. So they pretty much ignored the defensive side of the ball after having one of the worst run defenses in the league. Their first 3 picks were offensive players. I think the Packers had the worst draft in the league this year. The only good thing to come of their draft was the selection of A.J. Dillon, not for the Packers this year, but in the long term. Both Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams' contracts expire at the end of the 2020 season. And if you look back at Matt LaFleur's days with Tennessee, he was there when they drafted Derrick Henry while DeMarco Murray was still on the team and running the ball effectively. I drafted A.J. Dillon in both of my startup dynasty drafts this summer, and I'm pumped about the prospect of having a top running back that plays with Aaron Rodgers. One of those leagues, I'm the commissioner, and I allowed taxi spot, so he's going to be chilling in my taxi spot unless I need him. But yeah, I mean, if the writing's on the wall as far as Aaron Jones and Jamal Williams go, maybe one of them goes, maybe neither of them go. I don't know, but you don't take a running back in the second round when you already have a dude who tied for the most touchdowns among running backs last year, unless you plan on making a change to that position. So I'm convinced that come the end of 2020, you will not see Aaron Jones on this football team, or maybe you won't see Jamal Williams and they kind of move Aaron Jones into that role. That's definitely going to be one of the more fun things to monitor during next season's offseason. As far as the Packers' schedule goes, they have a very tough first 9 games. It doesn't help that they have their bye in Week 5. I would hate to have my bye before like Week 7 or 8 at the earliest. But they start Week 1 at the Vikings. Week 2, they get the Lions in Lambeau. I know it's the Lions, but it's still a division game. Then Week 3, they're at the Saints. Definitely not a fun place to play. Week 4, they're at home against the Falcons. Week 5, they get that bye. Week 6, they're at the Buccaneers. 7, they're at the Texans. That's 2 pretty tough games. Week 8, home against the Vikings. Again, a division game. And then Week 9, they're at the 49ers. So that, to me, is a pretty tough schedule to start off, the first 8 games of your season. So good luck to you, Green Bay. Next up is the Minnesota Vikings. They were 10-6 last year, 2-4 in the division. The Vikings' defense in 2019 was nowhere near as good as it had been the 3 previous seasons. They finished in the top 4 in fewest yards allowed from 2016 to 2018, but then they were 13th in that category last year. So they went from being really good to mediocre as far as yards allowed. They still allowed the 6th fewest fantasy points per game. The 6th fewest points per game. Not fantasy points, but real football NFL points. But it was not the usual Vikings defense we got used to seeing under Mike Zimmer during the first couple of years of his reign. We saw the Vikings go down to New Orleans in the first round of the playoffs, and they took it to the Saints. They won that game 26-20, fair and square. No crazy endings or blown calls. They held Drew Brees to just 200 yards passing and 1 touchdown. They did a great job keeping Alvin Kamara at bay as well. Only allowed him 55 total yards on 15 touches. And Michael Thomas only caught 7 passes, which is like half as much as he usually catches on a game-to-game basis. Then they ran into the buzzsaw that was the 49ers' run defense. The Vikings were only able to muster 21 rushing yards in the divisional round. After averaging 29 rush attempts a game and 127 rushing yards per game during the regular season, the Vikings were completely shut down by the running defense of the 49ers. All those Kirk Cousin haters out there, they got a whole crate full of ammo with that division game after he completed 72% of his passes. He's gonna complete passes, but he only threw for 172 yards. He had 1 touchdown and 1 interception. That's not the QB line you want from a dude who you're paying. I think he's the 3rd or the 4th highest paid quarterback now in the league or something crazy. After only 14 starts in his first 2 seasons, Dalvin Cook finally gave us fantasy owners a full season or close to it, 14 starts. Was still an annoying number 1 running back, though, missing the fantasy championship in Week 16, but he was still a top 5 running back in non-PPR, top 5 in half PPR, and he was number 6th in full PPR. He had over 1,600 total yards on 250 carries and 53 catches. So he was definitely one of those top-tier running backs that was very much involved in the passing game, which is what you love to see. And he had 15 total touchdowns, so that's always a good thing as well. More touchdowns than starts. That's what you like to see. He is now threatening to hold out this season if he doesn't get a new contract. I get it that these players need to make their money when they can. I hate hearing people, bash professional athletes for how much money they make, because at the end of the day, the money is there. It's either going to go to the players or it's going to go to the owners, and I'd much rather see the players make that money than the owners get an extra $1 billion or whatever it happens to be. But it's different when you're talking about young dudes who aren't even halfway through their rookie contract. I like I said, I get it. These dudes need to make their money when they can, especially at running back. But Jesus, dude, you've only played in 29 games in your 3 seasons. You had that ACL injury his rookie year, had hamstring and I think it was calf issues last year that constantly nagged him. That was obviously as a result of the hamstring issue the year before. Then he had the shoulder issues that kept him out of weeks 16 and 17 of last year. These guys all demanding that they get new contracts after only being in the year for 3 seasons. I'm talking about Jamal friggin' Adams. To me, it's just dumb as hell, man. You get drafted, you sign your deal, you play it out, then you go to free agency, especially in Jamal Adams' case. He was making $5 million a year. He was a first-round pick, top 10 pick. I just don't get it, man. As a Jets fan, it just sucks. Your team just makes horrible first-round picks every single year. You finally seem like you hit on a guy, and he doesn't want to play here. Typical. But these guys have no problem signing deals right out of college, but then 2 or 3 years later, they're threatening to hold out if they don't get a new deal. Honestly, I think they rushed this latest CBA. I think the running backs needed to do something. I think the Players Association doesn't do enough for those running backs. They need to be represented better. I think they need to make more money off the bat, but I do not think that after 2 or 3 years they should be demanding to get a new contract. But apparently this year the new CBA is extremely restrictive as far as guys holding out. So we'll see what comes of this. The Vikings used their franchise tag on safety Anthony Harris, and they put a second-round tender on linebacker Eric Wilson. They re-signed their kicker, Dan Bailey, and running backs Amir Abdullah and C.J. Ham, plus they gave a 1-year deal to Tajay Sharp. Like a whole lot of other teams, the defense lost a lot this offseason with both Trey Waynes and Xavier Rhodes, both starting cornerbacks last year. They left in free agency. They also lost another 3 defensive backs, so the secondary took a pretty big hit. The defensive line also took a significant hit with Linval Joseph and Stephen Weatherly signing elsewhere, and Everson Griffin gone as well. So the Vikings defense lost a lot of guys, which is why they did what they did in the draft. They set themselves up with 5 picks in the first 3 rounds after the Stephon Diggs trade to the Bills. They got a boatload of picks for him. 3 of their picks were compensatory picks, so they ended up making 15 selections. With all the losses in the secondary, no surprise, the Vikings took 5 defensive backs. 3 of them were corners. First-rounder Jeff Gladney from TCU. Third-rounder Demarion Densler from Mississippi State. And then fifth-rounder Harrison Hand from Temple. They've always been a team that loves drafting cornerbacks high. Now, in the last 8 drafts, the Vikings have spent a first-round pick on a corner 4 times. So the Vikings have one of the better tandems at safety with Harrison Smith and Anthony Harris. And they're going to need them this year because they're going to be very young in the secondary, something to keep in mind for those NFC North quarterbacks, Rodgers, Stafford, and Trubisky or Foles, whoever ends up winning that spot, which we'll get into next, actually. Key schedule run for the Vikings. Their first 6 games are all pretty tough. Week 1, they're at home against the Packers. Week 2, they're at the Colts. Week 3, they're at home against the Titans. Week 4, they are at the Texans. Week 5, at Seattle. And then Week 6, they host the Falcons. So pretty tough stretch for them in the beginning of the season, just like the Packers, which may open the door for the next team here, the Chicago Bears, who finished 8-8. They were 4-2 in the division, surprisingly. Pretty disappointing season for the Bears in Matt Nagy's second year as head coach. They went from 12 wins and a wild card loss to the Eagles to a 500 season the year after. Mitchell Trubisky regressed in his third year. He had 80 more pass attempts, but had a lower completion percentage, fewer passing yards and touchdowns, and in 2019 he had less than half of the amount of rushing yards and first downs that he did in 2018. So he wasn't running anywhere near as much. He wasn't picking up as many first downs with his legs. He had 9 games where he either threw no touchdowns or he threw more interceptions than touchdowns. The Bears were 29th in points per game and total yards per game. They were 26th in passing yards per game, and Trubisky finished as the number 26 quarterback. They declined his 5th-year option, so if he does not wow the coaching staff and management in 2020, he'll be done in Chicago. One of the moves they made this offseason was to trade their compensatory 4th-round pick to Jacksonville for Nick Foles. Not a bad deal. Not the move the Bears wanted to make after passing on Patrick Mahomes and Deshaun Watson to pick Mitchell Trubisky 2nd overall in the 2007 draft. Just brutal, dude. You had your chance to get Mr. Patrick Mahomes or Deshaun, and you went with the dude from North Carolina. Foles is very familiar with the Bears coaching staff. He and Matt Nagy were in Philadelphia together in 2012, and then again in Kansas City in, I think, 2016. 2017? No, 2016 maybe. The Bears offensive coordinator, Bill Lazor, he coached Foles in 2013 in Philadelphia. And the Bears' new quarterbacks coach, John DeFilippo, he won a Super Bowl with Foles in Philadelphia. So we'll see if they let Trubisky start the year on a short leash and then have Foles kind of lurking in the shadows, or if they'll just straight up give the team to Foles, let him run the offense from day one, and let him quarterback the team. I hope they do the latter. I think this offense will be much better with Nick Foles. I think the fantasy relevant players on this offense will benefit more from having Foles than Trubisky. Despite the poor play from the quarterback, Allen Robinson was able to finish as the number 11 wide receiver in half PPR last year. Was 2 catches shy of hitting 100, had 1,150 yards with 7 touchdowns. Not quite as good as his 2015 season with the Jaguars when he finished 6th with 1,400 yards and 14 touchdowns, but still really impressive. To put up those kind of numbers with a guy like Trubisky at quarterback who looks kind of like a complete bust, definitely impressive. Anthony Miller is another wide receiver on this team to keep your eye out on. He is one of those candidates for the third-year breakout wide receivers. If Foles does start the whole year, I think we'll see Miller's production go up for sure. So somebody that if you haven't had your dynasty draft, maybe this is a guy you take towards the end of the draft and hope that he turns into one of these breakout third-year wide receivers. As far as free agency goes for the Bears, they lost a handful of big names, including Prince Amukamara, Leonard Floyd, Trey Burton, even though he didn't do a damn thing with the Bears, and Clinton Dix. They re-signed linebacker Danny Trevathan and safety Deion Bush. They gave a 1-year deal to cornerback Artie Burns from Pittsburgh. And then they signed Tashawn Gibson and Barkevious Mingo. But the most puzzling of all of their signings to me is they gave $40 million guaranteed to edge rusher Robert Quinn and tight end Jimmy Graham, 2 guys that are getting up there in age, especially Jimmy Graham. Their draft, they had no first-round picks because of that Khalil Mack trade that they made 2 years ago. But they still made 7 picks. Their first pick was at 43 overall. They took a tight end from Notre Dame, Cole Kmet. Pretty interesting that after signing Jimmy Graham in free agency that they then used their first pick on a tight end as well. Then 7 picks later, they took a cornerback from Utah, Jalen Johnson. With the 3 fifth-round picks that they had, they took 2 more defensive players, including another corner, Kendall Vilder, and a wide receiver, Darnell Mooney. He was from Tulane. So he apparently has got a lot of promise. Maybe he's a guy that can step in and play that wide receiver 3 role. Kind of a long shot for a 5th-round pick, but we'll have to see what happens there in Minnesota. Then in the 7th round, they took 2 offensive linemen, which CBS gave D-plus grades to both picks. Kind of seemed like they just, whatever, let's just take a couple offensive linemen. Like I said, they signed Artie Burns and Deion Bush to fill the holes left by Prince Amukamara and Clinton Dix, but both of those signings were only 1-year deals, so I was really surprised that they didn't draft a safety. Chicago's offensive line ranked 29th in run blocking and 21st in pass protection last year, according to Pro Football Outsiders. And it was also very surprising that they waited until the 7th round to take an offensive lineman. One thing I think we can conclude from their draft is that the Bears are going to try and run an offense as close to what Philadelphia had in 2017 as they can get. They bring in Nick Foles with these 2 big-ass tight ends that they got. They're going to try and emulate the whole Ertz-Goddard thing, or I guess it was Ertz Trey Burton thing when it was in Philadelphia. But to me, the biggest question is the running back position, besides quarterback, obviously. But you got David Montgomery and Tariq Cohen are both pretty solid backs at what they do best, but I'm not sure either of them are versatile enough to keep defenses honest. The other teams, they know when Cohen is in the game, it's most likely pass. When Montgomery's in the game, it's most likely run, right? Cohen saw only 15% of the team's carries, but saw 18% of the team's targets. On the contrary, David Montgomery saw 61% of the carries and only 6% of the targets. Montgomery just does not get the targets to make him any more than an RB2 in non-PPR leagues and a mid-level flex play at best in half PPR leagues. I'm not sure he's worth drafting. And he's worth drafting, but I'm not sure he's worth putting in your starting roster in full PPR leagues. Montgomery had 6 of the Bears' 8 rushing touchdowns last year. Trubisky had the other 2. He also had 1 receiving touchdown, but his 7 touchdowns accounted for 26% of his fantasy points. He finished as the number 25 running back in half PPR, 12 spots higher than Tariq Cohen. I think Montgomery will see the majority of the goal line touches, but he's going to be touchdown dependent just like he was last year. And then you got Tariq Cohen, who I think could easily be Darren Sproles 2.0, but the problem is the touches. He averaged 4 carries and 6.5 targets a game last year. You love the targets, but the carries, you really want to see them get closer to 5 or 6 a game. If that happens, I think he could be a great value there in the middle of the draft, especially in full PPR leagues. You got to figure if Foles starts ahead of Trubisky, that Cohen will be able to develop a better chemistry with Foles. Foles has shown he can deliver the ball with accuracy to running backs coming out of the backfield and get them some opportunities to make a play, put it in a position where they can catch it and go. Last year we saw Trubisky miss on a whole bunch of just easy dump-off passes to Cohen, little screens and waggles and stuff. So definitely pretty disappointing. Their key schedule run, Week 7, they're at the Rams. Week 8, they're at home against the Saints. Week 9, they're at the Titans. Week 10, they're versus the Vikings. Then they get their bye in Week 11, so that's good. But then in Week 12, they're at the Packers. Week 13, a division game against the Lions. Week 14, they're at home against the Texans. And then Week 15, they're at the Vikings. So I'm not sure what to expect from this Bears team because we don't know what's going to happen with this quarterback position. All things are pointing towards Nick Foles getting the start, but we really just don't know. The Lions season was over after Matthew Stafford went down in Week 9. They finished 3-12. They were 0-6 in the division. They were forced to start David Blau in 5 games and Jeff Driscoll in 3 games. Between the two of those quarterbacks, they threw 8 touchdowns and 10 interceptions. They averaged about 200 passing yards a game in those 8 games. They went 0-8, and they were trash. But they had a losing record with Stafford before he got hurt. They were 3-4-1. So I'm not going to sit here and say that it was all the backup quarterback's fault. The Lions season just went to hell. Stafford couldn't pull out the overtime win against one of the worst defenses in the league last year, the Arizona Cardinals, in Week 1. Then his only 3 wins were against the Chargers, Eagles, and Giants. The Lions didn't score a touchdown until midway through the fourth quarter against the Chargers, and they got lucky that the Chargers offense somehow was worse than the Lions that day. Then it took a 100-yard kick return from Jamal Agnew for the Lions to scratch out a 3-point win against the Eagles. Then they just barely survived a 4-point game against the Giants after losing 2 straight division games. The Lions' defense was horrible last year. They allowed the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, the 3rd most to running backs, the 6th most to wide receivers, and the 10th most to tight ends. Jesus. So playing against the Lions was usually a good thing for us fantasy owners. They gave up the 7th most points per game and the 9th fewest takeaways per game as well. So they were just all around a very bad defense. Might be why they let 3 of their defensive starters from last year sign elsewhere this offseason, and then they had another 7 defenders from last year who they have not re-signed. As far as free agency goes, they have been by far the most active team in free agency from the NFC North. They've either signed, re-signed, or traded for 15 players. 3 players from New England, where head coach Matt Patricia cut his teeth for years, and another 4 players from opposing NFC North teams. So they're kind of scalping guys from their division. They re-signed safety Miles Killebrew and their tackle Ode Obosie. They traded a 5th-round pick for defensive back Duron Harmon and a 7th-round pick also they got back with that the Harmon trade. They also traded away cornerback Darius Slay for a 3rd and a 5th-round pick. The Lions lost outside linebacker Devin Kennard, defensive tackle Alshon Robinson, and cornerback Rashawn Melvin. And it seems like they're going to let guys like defensive tackle Damian Snacks Harrison walk in free agency. But they've signed almost an entirely new starting defense. They got 2 defensive tackles, Nick Williams, Danny Shelton. They got 3 linebackers, Jamie Collins, Reggie Ragland, and Elijah Lee. And they got 5 defensive backs. Desmond Trufant, Tony McRae, Darrell Roberts, like I said, Duron Harmon, and Jaron Kearse. So they literally went out and signed pretty much an entirely new defense. On offense, they signed a pair of wide receivers, Geronimo Allison and Jeremy Davis, plus a guard, Big V, Hala Pulavati Vatai. Matt Patricia was supposedly a defensive genius, and in his 3 years as Detroit's head coach, the Lions' defense has not been very good. They haven't had a winning season under him yet, so this will be a big year for the Lions. We'll see if all these defensive signings can kind of come together and they could have a respectful team here. With the draft, they took 9 players, 4 defenders, 3 offensive players, and then 2 offensive linemen. 2 of the cornerbacks that they added in free agency, Darrell Roberts and Desmond Trufant, are both on 1-year deals, and Desmond Trufant will be 30 by the time the season starts. So they needed some youth in the secondary. They got it. 3rd overall, they took corner from Ohio State, Jeff Okudah. The Lions were tied with the Falcons and Seahawks with the 2nd fewest sacks last year, so getting a young pass rusher was a good idea. In the 3rd round, they took Julian Okwara from Notre Dame. They lost right tackle Ricky Wagner to the Packers in free agency, but they picked 2 guards with back-to-back picks in the 3rd and 4th round instead of going for a tackle. Kind of interesting. But the most interesting thing for the Lions in the draft was DeAndre Swift from Georgia with this in the 2nd round. With 23-year-old Kerryon Johnson still on the roster and so many holes on this team, little surprising that they went running back in the 2nd. Then again, last year, 9 different running backs ran the ball for the Lions. Kerryon Johnson only started 7 games again in 2019, same as 2018. So I think the Lions no longer look at him as a guy they can count on to take a big workload. And if you look at the list of Georgia running backs over the past 6 years, you got Todd Gurley, Nick Chubb, and Sonny Michel. All have had an impact on fantasy teams. All 3 of them have taken an NFL workload. So you look at the schedule for the Lions. Week 12, they get the Texans at home. Week 13, they're at the Bears. Week 14, they're home against the Packers. Week 15, they're at the Titans. Week 16, they get to host the Buccaneers and Tom Brady. And then in Week 17, they host the Vikings. So pretty rough second half of the schedule for the Lions. That is the NFC North. That is the last of our division previews. I think next week we're going to go with the position previews, or we might take a detour and check out my tight end anytime scoring parlays from last year. It's going to be a big part of the Kickin or Stickin show this year. So thanks again for tuning in. Make sure you check us out next week. And as always, may the fantasy gods be cruel to your opponents.
You have been listening to the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. For more great episodes and information, follow us on social media and tune in every week. Kickin or Stickin is available on Google Podcasts, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Alexa, Reach.tv, or your favorite podcast service. Kickin or Stickin is a proud member of the HC Universal Network family of podcasts. To find out more about this and other great shows on our network, visit us online at hcuniversalnetwork.com today. Fantasy football is fun, but gambling addiction destroys lives. If you or someone you love suffers from gambling addiction, please do not be afraid to seek help. The National Council on Problem Gambling operates the National Problem Gambling Helpline Network. Contact them today at 1-800-522-4700. Thank you for tuning in to the Kickin or Stickin Fantasy Football Podcast. Please remember to play responsibly and always look for your man downfield.